Look at her standing there, just waiting, patient, trusting. Mary Carter has no idea that the man crouched at her feet. The professional in the clean blue jumpsuit with his organized toolcase spread across the hallway floor is doing something far more sinister than cutting a replacement key. In that narrow apartment corridor, fluorescent lights washing everything in cold white brightness, she's watching what she thinks is a simple service call. A locksmith fixing her problem, but what you just witnessed, that 12-second clip of sterile hallway and routine transaction, that was the last time Mary Carter was ever seen alive. The last time security cameras would capture her breathing, moving, existing in this world. And the man in front of her? He wasn't just making one key that day in March of 2021, he was making two. Have you ever been locked out of your apartment? That specific kind of panic, when you pat your pockets and realize your keys aren't there. Maybe you've had to call a locksmith. Scroll through Google results. Pick a company with decent reviews and hope for the best. It's one of those vulnerable moments we all face eventually. You're standing in a hallway, embarrassed, inconvenienced, just wanting to get back inside your home. The last thing on your mind is danger. The person you call is there to help, right? Mary Carter thought so. On March 14, 2021, the 28-year-old elementary school teacher had one of those mornings. She'd left for her Sunday grocery run, arms full of reusable shopping bags, mind probably on lesson plans for the week ahead. Somewhere between her third-floor apartment in the Riverside Commons complex in Richmond, Virginia, and the Whole Foods 3 blocks away, her keys had vanished. Fallen from her coat pocket maybe. Slipped through a hole in her purse lining. The how didn't matter. What mattered was that when Mary returned at 10:47 a.m., organic vegetables and almond milk in hand, she couldn't get into her apartment. The Riverside Commons was one of those newer developments that had sprouted up along the James River in the late 2010s. Clean, modern, safe. White walls, beige tile floors, security cameras in every hallway, electronic fobs for the main entrance. The kind of place where young professionals paid premium rent for the illusion of urban living with suburban security. Mary had moved in 8 months earlier, excited about her own space after years with roommates. She loved the natural light in her corner unit, apartment 3C. She loved being able to walk to the farmer's market on Saturdays. She'd told her mother it felt like finally being a real adult. Standing in that hallway with her groceries, Mary did what anyone would do. She pulled out her phone and searched for locksmiths near me. The first result was a company called Quick Access Lock Services, 4.3 stars, over 200 reviews, available 24/7. She called the number. A friendly voice answered, professional and reassuring. Yes, they could have someone there within 45 minutes. Yes, they could make a new key on site. The service call would be $95 plus the cost of the key, standard rates for weekend service. Mary probably felt that little rush of relief. Problem solved. She set her grocery bags down against her door, maybe sent a text to a friend about her chaotic morning, and waited. What else could she do? At 11:34 a.m., her phone buzzed. The locksmith was in the lobby. Could she let him up? Mary pressed the button to release the electronic lock on the stairwell door. A few minutes later, footsteps echoed up to the third floor. And then he appeared. Brian Bailey, 41 years old. Medium build, maybe 5'10". Wearing that bright blue jumpsuit with black accents on the shoulders. The kind that screams legitimate tradesperson. He carried a large black toolcase that looked professional and well used. He smiled politely, asked which door was giving her trouble, and got straight to work. This is what the footage shows you, that mundane professionalism. Watch it again in your mind. The way he's crouched over his toolcase, the way Mary stands at a respectful distance, hands at her sides. She's not hovering or anxious. She's just waiting, the way you'd wait for any contractor, a plumber, an electrician, someone fixing your problem. The hallway is bright and clinical, nowhere to hide, everything visible. What could possibly go wrong in such an exposed, monitored space? Brian Bailey worked quickly. He examined the lock, made some authoritative comments about the cylinder mechanism that Mary probably didn't fully understand but found reassuring. He pulled out his tools, his key-cutting equipment. The sound of metal on metal echoed down that narrow corridor. Other residents were home, surely. Behind those heavy fire doors, people were making Sunday brunch, watching TV, living their weekend lives. Mary stood there in her gray hoodie and dark pants, probably thinking about getting those groceries into the fridge before the milk got warm. What you couldn't see in that footage, what the high-angle camera couldn't capture, was Brian Bailey's hands during those crucial seconds between 0:04 and 0:06. Watch the video again. He's closing the tool case, standing up, his back is to the camera. His body blocks the view of his hands completely. His torso, his arms, the bulk of that professional jumpsuit. It all creates a blind spot. In those 2 seconds, maybe 3, his hands are invisible, completely invisible. And in a profession where success is measured in millimeters, where the difference between a working key and useless metal is microscopic precision, 2 seconds is an eternity. 2 seconds is enough time to palm a freshly cut key, enough time to slip it into one of those deep jumpsuit pockets. Enough time to create a duplicate that no one asked for, no one authorized, no one will know exists. But I'm getting ahead of the timeline. Let's go back to what Mary knew that morning, what she experienced. Brian Bailey finished the job. He handed her a new key, demonstrated that it worked perfectly in her lock. Mary probably tested it herself, that satisfying click of the deadbolt sliding home. He packed up his tools, gave her a receipt to sign, and explained the charges. $140 total. She paid with her credit card, probably grateful the ordeal was over. He thanked her for her business, wished her a good day, and walked back toward the stairwell with his heavy tool case. Professional, polite, forgettable. Mary Carter went inside her apartment, finally, put away her groceries. Maybe she called her mom to complain about the unexpected expense. Maybe she treated herself to a glass of wine with lunch because the morning had been stressful enough. Sunday continued. She graded some papers. She watched a movie. She went to bed that night with her new key on her key ring, her door locked, her apartment secure. Except it wasn't secure. Not anymore. Not even a little bit. When did Mary start to feel that something was wrong? Here's what her friends would later tell police. Mary had mentioned some strange occurrences in the weeks following March 14th. Small things. Unsettling things. Items that weren't quite where she'd left them. Her bathroom door ajar when she was certain she'd closed it. A window unlocked that she remembered securing. The kind of details you second-guess yourself about. Did I really put my hairbrush on the left side of the sink? Did I leave that cabinet open? Am I just being forgetful? On March 29th, 15 days after the locksmith visit, Mary texted her friend Jennifer about feeling watched. She couldn't explain it, she wrote. Just a creeping sensation when she was alone in the apartment. Like someone had been there. Like her space had been violated in a way she couldn't quite articulate. Jennifer suggested she was stressed from work, maybe not sleeping well. Get some rest, she advised. You're probably just tired. Mary wanted to believe that. Who wouldn't? The alternative was too disturbing to consider. That someone had access to her home. That someone was coming inside when she wasn't there. Or worse, when she was. Would you have trusted your instincts? Or would you have done what Mary did? Dismissed those whispers of unease, convinced yourself you were being paranoid, went about your normal routine because the alternative was too frightening. April 2nd, 2021. A Friday evening, Mary Carter's mother, Patricia, called her daughter's cell phone at 6:15 p.m. They had plans to meet for dinner at 7 o'clock. Mary didn't answer. Patricia assumed she was running late, maybe still at school, finishing up before spring break. She called again at 6:45. Voicemail. At 7:20, sitting alone at the restaurant, Patricia felt the first prickle of real worry. Mary was never late. Never failed to call if plans changed. This wasn't like her. Patricia drove to Riverside Commons. She had a key to Mary's apartment, the old key, from before the lockout incident, which Mary had eventually found in her car's center console. Patricia took the elevator to the 3rd floor. Walked down that same sterile hallway where the cameras had captured her daughter's last living moments. She knocked on apartment 3C, no answer. She called out Mary's name, nothing. The horrible silence of an empty apartment except, was it empty? She used her key. The door opened. Everything looked normal at first. Neat. Organized. Mary's purse was on the kitchen counter. Her phone was plugged in by her bed, which explained why she wasn't answering. Her car was in its assigned spot in the garage. All the signs that Mary should be home. But she wasn't. The apartment had that peculiar stillness of a place recently vacated. And then Patricia noticed the bedroom. The comforter was pulled back. One pillow showed the indentation of a head, like someone had been sleeping or lying down. But on the floor beside the bed, barely visible unless you walked around to that side of the room, a small smear of red on the cream-colored carpet. Not much, just a few drops. Enough to make Patricia's breath catch in her throat. She called 911 at 7:52 p.m. Richmond police arrived within 8 minutes. Officers conducted a sweep of the apartment, finding no signs of forced entry, no obvious evidence of struggle beyond those few drops of blood. The living room was undisturbed. Kitchen clean. Bathroom showed signs of recent use. A damp towel, water spots on the mirror. In the bedroom, investigators found something that made their skin crawl. The window that opened onto the fire escape, the one that should have been locked from the inside, was ajar. Just barely. Half an inch of opening. Like someone had closed it carefully but not quite latched it. Like someone had used it as an exit. But here's where things get strange. That window was on the 3rd floor. The fire escape led down to an alley, but you couldn't access it from the ground. The lowest ladder was retracted, a security feature. To use that window as an exit, you'd either need to be incredibly athletic, willing to risk a dangerous jump, or you'd need to have entered through the front door and wanted an escape route that avoided the hallway cameras. The blood drops were tested immediately. Type matched Mary Carter's. DNA confirmation would take days, but her mother knew. Mothers always know. The investigation moved fast. Richmond Police Detective Sarah Morrison took lead on what was now officially a missing persons case with suspicious circumstances. Within hours, it escalated to suspected homicide. That blood. The open window. The phone left behind. Mary's car untouched. No woman leaves voluntarily without her phone, her wallet, her vehicle. Something terrible had happened in apartment 3C. Detective Morrison started with the basics. Who had access? Building security showed electronic fob logs. Mary's fob was last used at 10:52 a.m. on April 2nd, when she'd returned from morning errands. No other fobs accessed her floor between then and when Patricia arrived. So either the perpetrator lived on that floor, or they had another way in, a key perhaps. The management office provided a list of all keys issued for apartment 3C. One set to Mary. One set to building management, kept in a locked box. One set that Mary had mentioned losing and replacing, and there was a record of the charge on her credit card. March 14th. $140 to quick access lock services. Do you see where this is going? Can you feel the pieces starting to connect? Detective Morrison called Quick Access Lock Services. The company existed, legitimate business, operating in Richmond for 7 years. But when she asked about the service call to Riverside Commons on March 14th, the dispatcher checked their logs and found nothing. No record of a call to that address. No technician dispatched. No Brian Bailey in their employment records. Not now. Not ever. The number Mary had called, it wasn't the real Quick Access Lock Services. It was close. Same name. Similar branding, but a different phone number, one that had been purchased through an online service just 3 days before Mary needed a locksmith. The website Mary had found? A near-perfect clone of the legitimate company's site, created to appear in local search results, designed to trap people in exactly Mary's situation. Desperate. Vulnerable. Trusting. Whoever had created that fake website, that spoofed phone number, that entire fraudulent operation, they'd been hunting, waiting for someone to take the bait. And Mary Carter had been unlucky enough to be locked out on the wrong Sunday. The security footage from March 14th was pulled immediately, and there it is. What you watched at the beginning. The man in the blue jumpsuit, the professional demeanor, The tool case, the victim standing patiently while her murderer worked at her feet. Because make no mistake, the person in that footage, the man who called himself Brian Bailey, he wasn't there to help Mary Carter. He was there to gain access to her life, to make a copy of her key, to create the opportunity that he'd exploit 19 days later. Can you imagine the planning, the premeditation, setting up a fake company, waiting for someone to need help, showing up with professional tools and a convincing act? This wasn't impulse. This was calculated, methodical, patient. FBI involvement came on April 5th when Detective Morrison realized the scope of what she was dealing with. This wasn't a crime of passion. This was predatory stalking with interstate fraud components. The fake website was hosted on servers in 3 different states. The phone number bounced through VoIP services that would take subpoenas to trace. And, most critically, Mary Carter was missing, and every hour that passed decreased the chances of finding her alive. If you had been Detective Morrison, where would you have looked first? The fire escape alley showed no blood, no evidence of a body being moved. Dumpsters in a 6-block radius were searched. Nothing. The James River was dragged at points near the apartment. Nothing. Mary Carter had seemingly vanished from a locked 3rd-floor apartment, with her blood on the carpet and a killer who had the key. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit built a profile. The suspect was organized, technically savvy, patient enough to wait weeks between obtaining the key and using it. He likely had a criminal record, possibly for burglary or sexual offenses. He was comfortable with technology, able to create convincing fake websites. He was probably between 35 and 50, working a job that gave him flexible daytime hours, and critically, he was local. He'd been watching Mary, learning her patterns, knowing when she'd be home alone. On April 8th, a breakthrough. A woman in Newport News, Virginia, nearly 2 hours from Richmond, reported that she'd been visited by a locksmith 3 weeks earlier under similar circumstances. She'd lost her keys at a shopping center, called a company from a Google search, and a man in a blue jumpsuit had arrived to help. Professional. Polite. Nothing had seemed wrong, but after seeing the news coverage of Mary's disappearance, something clicked in her memory. She still had the receipt. The company name was different. Rapid Entry Solutions instead of Quick Access, but the phone number was nearly identical, 1 digit off. The FBI traced both numbers. Both led back to prepaid phones purchased with cash at different retailers. But security cameras at those retailers provided images. And the man who bought those phones, he was cautious, but not perfect. In one frame, his face was partially visible. The FBI released the image to the public on April 10th. Tips flooded in, over 300 in the first 48 hours. Most were useless, well-meaning people who thought they recognized a neighbor or coworker. But tip number 287 came from a woman named Teresa Bailey in Alexandria, Virginia. She recognized the man in the photo. It was her ex-husband, Brian Bailey, 41 years old, divorced 3 years ago. Last known address in Richmond. Teresa Bailey told investigators something chilling. Her ex-husband had worked as a legitimate locksmith for 12 years before they divorced. She'd left him after discovering he'd installed hidden cameras in their home, in their bedroom, in her bathroom. She'd pressed charges, he'd pleaded to a misdemeanor, got probation, lost his locksmith license. But he'd kept his tools. And he told her during one of their final arguments that he'd never stop watching women, that it was who he was, that he couldn't help himself. Richmond police obtained a warrant for Brian Bailey's apartment on April 11th. He lived alone in a rundown complex in South Richmond, 30 minutes from Riverside Commons. When the SWAT team breached the door at 6:15 a.m., Brian Bailey was still asleep. Beside his bed was a handgun. In his nightstand drawer was a key that looked brand new, freshly cut. A key that, when tested later, would open apartment 3C at Riverside Commons perfectly. But they didn't find Mary, not in the apartment, not in his car, not anywhere obvious. What they did find made experienced homicide detectives physically ill. On his laptop, in folders he'd barely bothered to encrypt, were hundreds of photographs. Women in their homes, sleeping, showering, changing clothes. Most of the images were time-stamped and geotagged, different apartments across Richmond and surrounding areas. Different victims who had no idea they'd been violated. And in a folder dated March 2021, there were 43 photographs of Mary Carter. In her apartment, in her bedroom, in her bathroom. Taken over the 19 days between when he'd made the duplicate key and when she disappeared. The final photograph in that folder was dated April 2, 2021, at 6:47 p.m., just hours before Patricia had arrived looking for her daughter. The image showed Mary's bedroom, but Mary wasn't in it. The photograph was of the carpet, the blood-stained carpet. And the image's metadata was located in the basement storage unit of Brian Bailey's apartment building. They found Mary Carter at 2:34 p.m. on April 11, 2021. In storage unit B7, wrapped in plastic sheeting, hidden behind boxes of his old locksmith equipment. The medical examiner would later determine she'd been strangled manually, died sometime between 5 o'clock and 7 p.m. on April 2nd. She'd been in her apartment, probably getting ready for dinner with her mother. Brian Bailey had let himself in with his duplicate key. He'd waited for her. And when she'd walked into her bedroom, he'd been there. Brian Bailey was arrested and charged with first-degree murder, breaking and entering, stalking, and 12 counts of voyeurism relating to the other women in his photographs. At first, he said nothing. Lawyered up immediately. But on April 15th, in a move that stunned his public defender, he requested to speak with Detective Morrison. Alone. What he told her in that interview room would ensure he'd never see freedom again. He confessed to everything, not out of remorse, but because he wanted recognition. He wanted credit for his planning, his patience, his method. This is what narcissistic killers do, isn't it? They can't help but brag about their intelligence. Brian Bailey explained that he'd been running the fake locksmith scheme for 8 months. Setting up fake websites and phone numbers, waiting for emergency calls from women who lived alone. He'd helped 11 women before Mary, made duplicate keys for all of them, entered their homes repeatedly to photograph them, to watch them sleep, to satisfy urges he described in language too disturbing to repeat here. Mary was different, he said. Mary had noticed things. She'd been too aware, too close to figuring it out. He saw her texting her friend about feeling watched. He knew she'd report it soon, maybe change her locks, maybe call police. So he'd accelerated his timeline. He'd gone to her apartment that Friday evening, planning only to watch her again. But she'd come home early, she'd seen him, and he'd panicked. Strangling her hadn't been the plan, he claimed, as if that mattered, as if unplanned murder was somehow less evil. He disposed of her body in his storage unit because he couldn't think clearly, couldn't figure out what else to do. And then he'd tried to stage it like she'd left through the window, hoping police would think she'd run away or been kidnapped by someone else. His arrogance had convinced him he was smarter than the investigators, that his carefully constructed fake identity would protect him. The trial was mercifully brief. Brian Bailey pleaded guilty to avoid the death penalty. On September 3, 2021, he was sentenced to life in prison without possibility of parole. The other women whose photographs were found, 11 of them came forward. 11 women who had trusted a professional in a blue jumpsuit, who had let him into their homes, into their lives, who had been violated in the most intimate way possible without ever knowing until detectives knocked on their doors with the horrible truth. Mary Carter's funeral was held on April 18, 2021. Her third-grade students made drawings for her. One little girl wrote, "Thank you for teaching me to read, Miss Carter. I love you." Her mother, Patricia, gave a eulogy about a daughter who'd wanted only to help children learn, to build a good life, to be safe in her own home. That last one, that basic human need for safety in your own sanctuary, Brian Bailey had stolen that from her, from all of them. Think about that footage one more time. Those 12 seconds of hallway, fluorescent lights, routine transaction. Mary Carter standing there, trusting, patient, waiting for her problem to be solved. She had no way of knowing she was watching her own murder being set up. No way of knowing that the helpful professional at her feet was memorizing the layout of her apartment, planning his return, crafting the key that would unlock not just her door but her death. That hallway was bright and monitored and safe, except it wasn't. Because safety is an illusion when the person you trust to restore it is the one who's planning to destroy it. The FBI investigated further and found evidence that Brian Bailey had been refining this method for years, possibly in other states before settling in Virginia. They found records of similar fake locksmith websites in North Carolina and Maryland, all taken down shortly before he'd moved. How many other victims might be out there? Women who felt uneasy in their homes but never knew why will probably never be fully known. Mary Carter was 28 years old. She loved teaching. She loved her students. She loved having her own space, her independence, her life. All of it was stolen by a man who used professional expertise as camouflage for predatory evil. And it started with 12 seconds of footage that looked like nothing more than a simple service call. If you're watching this, please listen to your instincts. If something feels wrong in your home, if you feel watched, if items seem moved, trust that feeling. Change your locks. Install your own cameras. Tell someone. Mary Carter felt it. She texted her friend about it, but like so many of us, she talked herself out of believing her own intuition because the alternative seemed too paranoid, too extreme. That hesitation cost her everything. Brian Bailey is currently housed in Red Onion State Prison in Virginia, in administrative segregation for his own protection. Other inmates don't take kindly to men who prey on women. He'll die there. That's the only certainty. But Mary Carter died in her own bedroom, in the apartment she loved, killed by a man she'd paid to help her. That's the injustice that will never balance. If this case has affected you, if it's made you think about your own safety or the safety of people you love, please don't just scroll past. Share this video. Let people know that monsters don't always look like monsters. Sometimes they look like professionals in blue jumpsuits with tool cases and polite smiles. Sometimes they're the people we call when we need help. And sometimes those 12 seconds of CCTV footage capture the exact moment when help becomes horror. Subscribe to this channel if you want more deep dives into cases like Mary's. Cases where the truth was hiding in plain sight. Where the last footage of someone alive tells a story they couldn't have known they were in. Hit that notification bell. And remember Mary Carter. Remember that she deserved better. Remember that we all deserve to be safe in our own homes. See you in the next one.